Hey everyone, welcome to On Tap. I'm Chris, and today is part 1 of 3 of the East Asian Lager Taste Test. And this is the first of 3 videos, where I review all of the beers from East and Southeast Asia that have been reviewed on this show thus far between both seasons 1 and 2. So with 20 beers to review, I'm going to be reviewing 10 in this episode and ranking them against each other, 10 in the next episode, and then in part 3, I'm going to be ranking the top picks. I'm going to estimate probably about 5 to 7, but we'll see, against one another to see which lager will reign supreme. So without any further ado, let's get to it. So let us begin the Great East Asian Lager Taste Test. And starting off, I think we should go with the Chinese classic, Tsingtao. And I'm gonna say that is a very solid, good beer. It's very clean, it's very refreshing, it's got a nice sort of little bit of fresh taste to it. That sort of, and I talked about this in the China episode, there's something about beers, certainly certain beers from China, but you could maybe say East Asia in general, where there's a unique fresh flavor to the beer, and Tsingtao absolutely has that. So it's not quite tart, it's not quite sharp, it's just sort of a little fresh and a little nice. And there's no sort of unpleasantness to this, there's none of that kind of bad undertone, which is always great. It's sort of a nice, clean, fresh lager where everything is perfectly well balanced. We're starting off well in the good category. Why not bring in a crosstown rival, little national rivalry here, Sapporo from Japan. Let's see how the Japanese beer stacks up against the Chinese beer. Remember, same color. This one has a slightly smaller head. This one pours with a slightly fluffier head. And I've said this before, and I will say it yet again. The thing about classic Sapporo lager is it's got a sharpness to it. This is more sort of fresh, this is a little sharper. And I think the main difference is the freshness in this is more soft. It's a strong note, but it's a little softer than this, where it's a little bit more defined. Also quite a good refreshing lager, but yeah, this one has just slightly more of a bite to it compared to the Tsingtao. But it's also, as far as I'm concerned, going in the good category. We'll see if we get to the very good category, but certainly in good, it's a bit stronger in your palate. This is a bit easier in the palate, this is a bit stronger in the palate. So this maybe comes down to a preference. So we've done China, we've done Japan. How about going and trying out Korea? OB Premier. This is the leading beer of the largest beer brewery in Korea. And let's see how this flavor profile compares to the sort of very popular Chinese and Japanese brands. This also has quite a fluffy head, similar to the Tsingtao, much unlike the Sapporo. This is the most, dare I say it, Western tasting of these 3 beers so far. It's the one that if you serve to me in a blind taste test, I would say this has more of a flavor profile I would think of as maybe sort of a pretty middle of the road European lager, something like that. It doesn't have quite the freshness or the sharpness of the Tsingtao or the Sapporo, but it's crisp, but it's maybe a little on the weak end of crisp. The weaker end of crisp. So, of the 3, this is, I wouldn't say as particularly notable in the flavor profile. It's perfectly fine, it's perfectly enjoyable, but it's very much in that category of being a fairly nondescript lager. It's in that category of it tastes like beer. It tastes like beer, there's nothing particularly that stands out about it, but there's also nothing I'd say objectively bad about it. So, China, Japan, South Korea. What else could we try? Well, there is Thailand. Thailand is Chang beer, or Chang. The 2 white elephants sitting under a tree, presumably in the hot sun. It's certainly got slightly more flavor, I think, than the OB Premier. And it's not bad. You know, I remember in the first episode when I had it, compared to the other two, I ranked Chang at the bottom, but comparing it at least with these three so far, it ranks reasonably fine. There's a little bit of a, I don't want to call it a spice, but a sort of slightly more interesting, maybe oxymoronically smooth kind of hoppy, yes. But I will say the body of it feels fairly weak. It's definitely a weaker body than these two. I'd say it's similar to this. It's maybe just got a slightly more interesting kind of pop to it compared to the OB Premier. But so I'm gonna rate it kind of somewhere around there. Though now that I think about it, actually, this has a little bit of a, no, it's fine, but just a teeny little bit of the aftertaste is not as ideal as I would like. So, you know, I might actually shift it around to more like this. So, China, Japan, South Korea, Thailand. Well, we are missing the Philippines. Let's try San Miguel Pale Pilsen. The best-selling beer in all of the Philippines. And as I said, if you're in the Philippines and you're drinking beer, statistically speaking, you're probably drinking one of these. This has a very sweet smell to it. The fact that the beer is able to pull that off and there's no sort of underlying unpleasantness to it, really for me, puts it, I think, quite well in the middle of the pack with these over here. Sugar in the tropics, great flavor. Next we have, let me do this one. Height Extra Cold, Ice Point filtration system. Just it does sort of remind me of, I don't need the opener because this is a can and it can open just like that. So reminds me very much of the US, just the extra cold and big bold letters there. Yep, smells like nothing. Nope, that is a definite pass. It has that flavor of not particularly enjoyable, sort of mass-produced, sort of Budweiser-ish type. I don't even know compared to a regular Budweiser how this would stack up, but you know, almost like a light beer kind of flavor. So yeah, this is definitely going in the pass category. So we have Asahi Super Dry. Super Dry, and this is the beer. Get that label down there. Come on, you. There you go. This is the beer with the dry Karakuchi flavor, as it's described, or sort of a dry flavor in the context of certainly beverages. And let's see how this stacks up. And look, I don't know about you, the more I've been trying this from the time I had it in the first episode, or in the sort of the Kirin and Asahi episode, I'm gonna stand by the flavor profile on this from that episode. This beer is very nice. I really enjoy that way that the dryness is worked into the lager, just like how I really appreciate with San Miguel. You have that kind of tropical, brown sugary, you know, I imagine bananas kind of sweetness worked into the lager. And whenever there's some sort of extra flavor that's a little bit unexpected or it's a little bit unique and different from what you would normally have with, you know, kind of these, you know, sort of your very middle of the road type lagers, I gotta give the beer points for that. So I'm putting Asahi up here into the certainly good category just because of that Karakuchi flavor. Yep, that works for me. That is a nice, very unique flavored lager. Number 8 is gonna be, why not? Yanjing or Yanjing. All right, so standard lager color, doesn't smell like anything, as is the case for a number, not all of them, but a number of them. Let's see how it stacks up. This is going here. It's It's better than the height. It's not as good as any of these. This is right on this line between what I would call pass and okay meh. I mean, this is like right on that line. If I had Yanjing and height were my only options, yes, I would go with this one, but compared to anything else on the table so far, no. The thing about this is it is not, the only thing I can say in its favor is it's not actively off-putting. It doesn't have any of the sort of not enjoyable, sour, tangy flavors of poorly made beer, but beyond that, it has almost no flavor. It is very light, and it's not particularly interesting in really any sense of the word. It's like Tsingtao if you took out almost all of the interesting notes from it, and you didn't make it a light beer, but you just kept it as a beer without any real character. That's what Yanjing tastes like. Yanjing is like Tsingtao's sort of tired cousin. It's the tired, sad cousin that's sort of vaguely similar, but just doesn't have any of the interesting characteristics that makes the other cousin sort of that much more liked by kind of the, you know, the friends, family, community, what have you. So it's going right there. Next up we have Asahi Black. So a newer beer in the scheme of things. I believe it was 2015. So let's take a taste. Now this is, I want to be clear, this is obviously a black lager. It's a very dark lager, but it is a lager nonetheless. And my thought was, there are going to be two of these dark lagers. They are lagers, and thus they are eligible for this competition. This is certainly going in the good category. Just trying to think where it might go. The thing about this is it's got a perfectly acceptable body. Got a little bit of those malty notes. And yes, it might be a little unfair that I'm comparing a beer that's of a somewhat different style to these other ones. So I like the little bit of extra malt in it, and it's perfectly balanced. It doesn't feel terribly watery. Obviously no off-putting flavors in any of this. And it's got, in a way, it's got a little bit of the sharpness that the Sapporo has, which is interesting. And obviously it's made by Asahi, different company, but that sharpness that I think what I realized what it was is, when I was growing up, or sort of 21 and over, sort of growing up, like early, sort of mid-20s, Sapporo was usually the beer that I would drink at sort of Japanese restaurants, and because it has that sharp flavor, I just associated that with, oh, well, that must be what beers from certain East Asian countries taste like. Me being me and not being as educated about the variety of different beers that are made in so many different countries. But I will say that the Asahi Black has a little similarity of that. Less so than the Asahi Super Dry, actually, which again has that nice, almost airy sort of floating flavor. Final beer of part 1. We have 9 on the table, but we're going for 10. That is Tsingha Premium Thai Beer. And while Chang might be the most popular beer in Thailand, apparently from sales volume, I believe, Tsingha is the one that has government approval. Well, obviously they all have government approval. They're allowed to be sold in the country, but you know what I mean. Tsingha is sort of is like the favored child of the government. It's got that royal license from the king of Thailand, who, if you didn't know, kind of a big deal. I don't know about you, but I really love the subtle, almost spiciness of Tsingha. So, shifting these down a little bit, maybe I'm biased, but there's something about the way that this bright, sort of sharp, but fresh and clean and almost spicy, not actually spicy, but almost spicy flavor is worked into Tsingha beer. It's something that I really like. It's similar to Asahi or San Miguel, where it's a very unique characteristic of that beer. And I really have to give it points for that. So between the sort of, let's say the 6, this is the one that, at least for me, is a bit of a front runner. So I'm just take a final taste here, but I really like that. In conclusion, for part 1 of 3 of the East Asian Lager taste test, last place we have Height Extra Cold. This tastes like a not particularly good quality light beer, the kind of thing that you'd get in a 30 rack. A 30 rack, that's what it is, a 30 rack. As far as I'm concerned, that is a hard pass. Genjing is right on this line between pass and barely acceptable. This is this beer that I put in the category of, if I were stuck in X place where there are not a whole lot of good options of beer to drink, and this were the only thing that I had available, I guess I would drink it. But in any other scenario, if you gave me anything else on this table here, or so many other beers, I would say absolutely not. In the middle tier, sort of the fine category, is really both Chang and Obi Premier. These are both extremely middle of the road lagers. They're the kind of drinks that, as I said, they taste like beer. They taste completely non-offensive. They're easy to consume. They're not particularly interesting. There's nothing off-putting about them. They are just easily sippable table lagers. This one is a little bit more, as I said, sort of Western style-ish is the best way I could describe it. You know, almost something a little bit more European-esque, where it doesn't have a particularly unique character to it. It's just very generic. And the Chang, it has a little bit more character, but there's a little bit more, not quite a spiciness, but a little bit more of a pop in the palate. But the aftertaste on this, I don't like as much. The aftertaste is not quite as nice. It's just got a tiny little bit of the, you know, less desirable flavor, but it's still, you know, fine. Now, in the solid good category, we have the largest concentration of beers here: Sapporo, San Miguel, Asahi Black, Tsingtao, and Asahi Super Dry. And Sapporo, classic Japanese beer with a bit of a sharp flavor that I would say, you know, works well at any sort of, not just sort of sushi restaurant, but sort of Japanese restaurant in general. I think this is a very versatile beer for the flavors you're gonna get in Japanese cuisine. San Miguel Pale Pilsen, I really like the sweet tropical flavor that goes with this. The sweet, sugary tropical flavor reminds me of just being in super hot weather where you want something that's refreshing and kind of, you know, sweet and enjoyable and nice, and I really like the uniqueness of this. Asahi Black, it's got a little bit of that Sapporo characteristic, but a little bit more of that roasted malty flavor that makes it a little bit more interesting and quite enjoyable to drink. And all the bodies on these beers, by the way, are perfectly fine. Tsingtao, this is in a way, and maybe it's just because it was the first one I started with, and I quite like the flavor of Tsingtao, but it's almost like your standard lager, but just it's really nicely done. So compared to all of these other beers here, Tsingtao is the one that's gonna have the least unique character, but in a way, by being just a really nice, it's like the, to use the pardon the expression, but it's like the lager next door, right? It's not particularly exciting or unique in terms of its specific flavor profile, but all of it together is just perfectly nice and enjoyable. And that in and of itself, I think there's a nice sort of simplicity in the enjoyment of what I think of as at least being a lager. And it has that unique sort of fresh flavor that, you know, I like certainly with Chinese beers. And Asahi, the Karakuchi flavor, so nicely worked in. Because usually I don't talk about light beers as being particularly great, and I don't mean this in the sense of light like a, you know, light beer, low calorie, low alcohol kind of thing. I mean light and airy and almost like fluffy. It just sort of sits on your palate, and it's just so soft and subtle, but there's this nice dryness to it that's worked in, which is really nice, and I think it's a really excellent characteristic of this beer. And finally, in first place, maybe this is a hot take, and we will see in part really 3 actually, because that's when we do the final elimination, I gotta give it to Singha. This beer, I just really love the bright, sort of almost spicy, but extremely refreshing, clean, and crisp lager flavor. It's got all of the familiar characteristics that I think of with something like a Tsingtao, or certain stuff worked into, you know, even an OB or a Sapporo, Chang a little bit. But it's got that extra kind of hit to it, which makes it so unique, and especially I think in a hot weather environment. You know, in later videos I'll talk about climate and stuff like that, but in a hot weather environment and with spicy food, I don't think anything can beat that. So that's my final assessment for part 1 of 3. So be on the lookout for part 2, where I review the next 10 beers that were discussed in seasons 1 and 2. And once I do that video, we will see how all 20 stack up against each other before we move into final sudden death elimination in part 3. That's my assessment. I hope you enjoyed. I'd be very curious to know if you think I am completely off the mark with this, if I'm reasonably close, if I'm maybe close with some beers, totally off the mark with others. As always, just, you know, please keep it civil in the comments, and I'll see you next time.